Hello there, it's Bishop Patrick from the chapel here in Bishop's house in Nottingham. It's lovely to be in contact with you all. I'm going to read part of the Gospel from Sunday. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Thomas, called the twin, who was one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. When the disciples said, "We have seen the Lord," he answered, "Unless I see the holes that the nails made in his hands, and could put my finger into the holes they made, and unless I can put my hand into his side, I refuse to believe." 8 days later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. The doors were closed, but Jesus came in and stood among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Then he spoke to Thomas. "Put your finger here. Look, here are my hands. Give me your hand. Put it into my side. Doubt no longer, but believe." Thomas replied, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "You believe because you can see me. Happy are those who have not seen and yet believe." There were many other signs that Jesus worked and the disciples saw, but they are not recorded in this book. These are recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing this, you may have life through his name. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. When something strange or out of the ordinary happens these days, there's often a call for a public inquiry with some high court judge or some other senior public figure appointed to preside over it. Imagine if what happened the first Easter were to happen today. There'd surely be an immediate call for an inquiry. A demand would be made for all the facts to be brought out into the open. Those claiming to have seen the risen Christ would be called upon as witnesses and would be thoroughly cross-examined. First of all, Jesus' death would have to be clearly established. This probably wouldn't take long and wouldn't create much of a problem. After all, it was a public event. It could be testified to by the soldiers who nailed him to the cross, who were later to break his legs to hasten his death, but who didn't need to do so because they saw he was dead. But just to be sure, one of them stuck a spear in his side. Then Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent public figure, could verify that he had sought permission for and had personally supervised Jesus' body being put in his own tomb. The women who in haste had wrapped Jesus' body for burial could also be brought forward as witnesses. So sufficient proof then of Jesus' death. But what about the claims that he had risen from the dead and had appeared to a number of different people? The various people then claiming to have witnessed Jesus risen from the dead would be called upon one by one to give an account of their experiences. Mary of Magdala would perhaps be called first to take the witness stand so as to describe her discovery of the empty tomb of Jesus. And the other named women would be asked to corroborate this. Under questioning and cross-examination, they describe seeing angels by the tomb. Just imagine the laughter this might cause in a modern public inquiry. Mary Magdala might be forced to admit that when she first saw the risen Jesus, she didn't recognize him. And then, given her medical record, she'd had some psychological problems in the past, it would be easy enough today to dismiss her as a credible witness. Perhaps Peter would be called next, followed by John, the beloved disciple. The servant girl would be found and asked to testify on oath that she had witnessed Peter swear several times that he didn't know Jesus. An expert psychologist might be able to suggest that both Peter and John had, as proven close associates of Jesus, been deeply traumatized by the events of previous days, the scourging and the death of their master. So their testimony to having met the risen Jesus could also be made out to be deeply flawed and so discounted. Next up to the witness stand might be the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, who claimed to have spent a few hours in the company of the risen Jesus without ever recognizing him, until they stopped for dinner. Oh yeah, it would be relatively easy in a modern public inquiry to ridicule and discredit the testimony of those key witnesses to the risen Jesus. Finally, perhaps, Thomas would be asked to take the witness stand. Quietly, he would recount how he was the one disciple of Jesus who refused to believe all the reports from individuals and from the whole group, minus him, that they had encountered Jesus. Indeed, he'd be able to give testimony that he'd asked for positive proof, nothing less than to be able to put his hands into Jesus' wounds from the cross. We can imagine now the sudden rapt attention of the presiding officer and the very hushed courtroom atmosphere of the public inquiry, as Thomas tells them that exactly 1 week later, the risen Jesus had appeared before him in the sight of the rest of the group and had invited him to do just that, to put his hands into his wounds. Thomas explains that Jesus, rather than being annoyed with him for wanting to seek this proof, simply says to him, "Put your hands here. Look, here are my hands. Give me your hand. Put it into my side. Doubt no longer, but believe." When asked what he then did, Thomas explains that he didn't have to do anything. He then simply knew it was Jesus risen from the dead. And so he acknowledged him with words of utter faith. Those beautiful words, "My Lord and my God." I was ordained a bishop for our diocese on the feast of St. Thomas, the 3rd of July. So I feel a particular closeness to Thomas, and I have to then declare a particular interest in him. I find it interesting that for all the bad press Thomas sometimes receives, "You doubting Thomas," as you know, is a derogatory expression, but it's used in many cultures. Thomas actually would probably be the strongest credible witness to the risen Jesus in a modern public inquiry. For me, Thomas is a deeply honest and authentic person of faith, in that while he is fearless in voicing his doubts, he is also quick to proclaim his faith. It's also worth pointing out that the 4 gospel accounts are consistent in revealing that all of Jesus' disciples, not just Thomas, struggled with initial doubts as the risen Jesus appeared to them. It was Jesus who had gradually to help them to come to a fuller personal faith in him. This time of the coronavirus pandemic is a frightening time for all of us, isn't it? And so I believe it's quite natural that this fast-changing situation should cause us all, should cause you to have doubts about where God is in all this. If you have those doubts, please don't feel anxious or embarrassed, because the coronavirus, or indeed just being young people, is an invitation, I think, from the Lord Jesus to question. So to have doubts and to question is good. What I want to say to you is this: Jesus, as with each of his first disciples, invites all of us into an honest personal relationship with him. He really wants to know each of you, and he really wants you to get to know him. So I would say to you, don't worry about doubts. Keep on asking the Lord Jesus questions. Seek to know and to understand him better and better. Never be embarrassed to ask any questions of the Lord in your times of prayer. Place your doubts, your fears and your anxieties before Him. Thank the Lord too for the gift of faith you have, even if you think it's only tiny. I often think how blessed I am to have the faith I have. It's true, my faith, like yours, needs always to grow, but I am so grateful to God that I am a person of faith. So ask the Lord to bless and deepen the faith you have. And then finally, I would say to you, take away with you in your heart this day these deeply encouraging words of Jesus from today's gospel. It came near the end. Jesus said to Thomas, let's hear Jesus saying to us, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." That's the way that Jesus looks upon us, even with all our doubts, as blessed in spite of our doubts. How good is that? Keep seeking the Lord, keep questioning, don't worry about doubts. God bless you all.